You are about to hear something that will make you think twice before ever sitting alone in a dark room with nothing but a microphone and dead air. These are not made-up stories. These are not campfire tales. These are real accounts from real people who sat alone in the silence of the night, broadcasting into the void, and something answered back. If you think you have heard scary stories before, I want you to stop right now, because nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, will prepare you for what these men experienced when the clock hit midnight and the phone lines went dead quiet. Stay with me until the very end, because the last story, I promise you, will change the way you sleep forever. Do not turn this off. You need to hear this. Story number 1. I need you to understand something about working the overnight shift at a radio station before I tell you what happened to me. Most people imagine it as this glamorous thing. You picture the cool DJ, leaning back in a leather chair, spinning records, talking smooth into a high-end microphone while the city sleeps. What they do not show you in the movies is the silence. The kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep, dark lake. That is what the overnight shift is really about. Hours and hours of that silence, broken only by the songs you play and the sound of your own voice echoing back at you through the studio monitors. I worked at a small FM station in rural Pennsylvania. The town had maybe 4,000 people in it. The station sat on the edge of town, surrounded by fields on 3 sides and a thick tree line on the 4th. The building itself was old, built in the late 1950s, and nobody had really done much to update it since the 70s. The walls were covered in old acoustic foam that had gone yellow and brittle, and the carpets were this horrible shade of brown that might have once been red. I do not know. I never asked. I had taken the overnight shift because I needed the money. I was 24 years old, fresh out of a communications program at a state school, and this was the only gig I could get. The pay was not great, but it was something. My shift ran from midnight to 6 in the morning. 6 hours alone in that building. Just me, the equipment, and whatever was out there in the dark beyond those windows. It started on my 3rd week at the station. Nothing dramatic at first, just a feeling. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and you just know, deep in your gut, that something is not right. Like the air has changed somehow, or the light feels different, or there is a sound you cannot quite identify but you know is there. That was what I started feeling around 2 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of playing a long set, 3 songs back to back, so I had a few minutes to stretch my legs. I got up from the console and walked down the narrow hallway that connected the broadcast booth to the small break room at the back of the building. The hallway was maybe 40 feet long with 4 doors off it. The bathroom, a storage closet, the station manager's office, and the break room at the end. All of them were dark. I had not turned any of the lights on because I had walked that hallway 100 times and knew it by heart. I got to the break room, poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot I had made at midnight, and I was just standing there, staring out the small window above the sink at the dark field behind the building, when I heard it. A sound coming from somewhere behind me, back down the hallway. It was soft, barely there, but in that absolute silence of the building at 2 in the morning, it was loud enough to stop my heart cold. It sounded like someone whispering. I turned around slowly. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and empty. The only light was the faint blue glow coming from under the broadcast booth door at the far end. I stood perfectly still for what felt like a full minute, listening. Nothing. Just silence. I told myself it was the building settling. Old buildings do that. They creak and groan, and sometimes the ventilation system makes noises that sound almost human. I was new to this place. I was not used to its sounds yet. That was all it was. I went back to the booth, slid back into my chair, and kept the show going. but I could not shake the feeling that something had changed in that building, something subtle. Like a door that you know you left open is now closed, but you cannot remember closing it and you are not quite sure if it matters or not. I kept working. Songs played. I did my breaks. I ran the weather. 2:30 came and went, then 3, then 3:30. By 4 o'clock I had almost forgotten about the whisper. Almost. Then the phone rang. Now the request line rang sometimes during the overnight shift. Not often. Maybe once or twice a night if I was lucky. Usually it was a trucker on the highway or a night shift worker somewhere killing time. I picked up on the second ring, put on my professional voice and said the station call letters and asked how I could help. Silence on the other end. Not dead silence. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady breathing. I said hello again. More breathing. I figured it was a prank call or a drunk dialer, which happened occasionally, and I was about to hang up when whoever was on the other end of that line spoke. They said one sentence, just one. They said, in a voice that was low and flat and completely without any emotion at all, they said, "I am standing right outside your window." I looked up at the window of the broadcast booth. The blinds were open about 2 inches, the way I always left them, just enough to let a little air in from the vent beneath the sill. And through that 2-inch gap, looking in at me from the darkness outside, was a pair of eyes. I am not going to be dramatic and say they were glowing or red or supernatural in any way. They were just eyes, human eyes, catching just enough of the monitor glow to be visible, and they were completely still, just watching me. I froze, I could not move, I could not speak. The breathing on the phone continued, slow and steady, and those eyes did not blink, did not move, just stared. I do not know how long I sat like that. It felt like hours, but it was probably 30 seconds. Then the eyes were gone. One moment they were there, the next they were not. I slammed the blinds shut and grabbed the phone and called the police. They came out, walked the perimeter, found nothing. No footprints outside the window, they said. The ground had been wet from rain earlier that night, so footprints would have been visible. There was nothing there, nothing at all. And I want you to sit with that for a moment, because that detail has never stopped bothering me. Wet ground, no footprints. But something was standing there. I finished my shift that night in a state of controlled terror. Every song that played was background noise to the hammering of my own heart. I sat as far back from the window as I could get without leaving my position at the console. When my replacement arrived at 6 and I told him what had happened, he gave me this look. This specific look that I would come to understand better over the following weeks. A look that was not surprise, not disbelief, more like recognition. He said, and I remember this exactly, he said, "Yeah, that happens here sometimes." And then he sat down and started his shift and did not say another word about it. I drove home in the gray morning light, and I sat in my car in my driveway for a full 15 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I slept with every light in my apartment on that day. That was the beginning of the worst 6 months of my life, and that was, without question, the tamest thing that happened to me in that building. What came next was so far beyond a pair of eyes at a window that, looking back now, that first night almost feels gentle by comparison. Because what I eventually figured out, after weeks of these experiences, after talking quietly to other staff members who had worked overnight shifts in that building over the years, was that there was something in that station that had been there for a very long time. Something that came alive, if that is even the right word, when the building was at its most isolated. When it was just one person, alone in the dark, broadcasting into the empty night. Something that did not like being ignored. I stayed in that job for 6 months after that first night. I am going to tell you that I probably should have quit after week 4, when something happened that I still cannot explain in any rational terms. But I needed the money, and human beings are remarkably good at convincing themselves that the things that frighten them are not as real or as threatening as they seem. I convinced myself every single day. And every single night I went back into that building and sat alone and broadcast and tried to ignore the things that happened in the dark around me. By the end, I was barely sleeping. I had lost weight. My friends started asking me if I was okay. I was not okay. But the thing I regret most, even now, years later, is not the fear, not the sleepless days, not the weight loss. What I regret most is the night I made the mistake of responding. The night I actually talked back into the darkness. Because once I did that, it knew I could hear it. And after that, it never left me alone. Story number 2. There is a term in radio production called dead air. It means silence where there should be sound. A gap in the broadcast. A moment where the microphone is live and the transmitter is running and everything is technically functioning but nothing is coming out. Dead air is the enemy of every broadcaster. You are trained from your first day in the industry to avoid it at all costs. Fill the silence. Always fill the silence. Talk, play music, run a promo, do anything, but never let the silence sit there and broadcast itself to whoever is listening. I worked at a news talk station in the Midwest for almost 8 years, and I did the overnight shift for 3 of those years. In 3 years of overnight shifts, I never once let dead air go more than 5 seconds before I corrected it. I was proud of that. My boards were clean. My timing was tight. I knew that studio like I knew my own apartment. Every piece of equipment, every cable, every quirk of the software, every hiss and hum and mechanical tick that the building made. I knew all of it. Which is why what happened on the 14th of October, approximately 2 years into my overnight run, is so profoundly difficult for me to explain. Because what happened that night was not an equipment failure. It was not human error. What happened that night was something that the dead air carried to an unknown number of listeners across 3 states, and to this day I do not know what it was or where it came from. The night started normally. I came in at 11:30 to do my handoff with the evening host, went over the rundown for the night, checked the wire feeds for any breaking news, made my coffee and settled in. By midnight I was on the air doing my first break. Weather, traffic advisory, a brief news headline roundup. Nothing unusual. The first couple of hours moved the way they always did, slow and steady and quiet. Around 2:15, I was midway through a long recorded interview segment, which gave me about 20 minutes of time where the content was running automatically and I did not need to be on the mic. I used that time to do what I always did during those windows. I went through the next hour of content, prepped my notes, checked my email, made sure everything was queued correctly for the rest of the night. Completely routine. The recorded segment ended at 2:37 exactly. I know the time because I was watching the clock as I always did, waiting for my cue to come back on the mic. 2:37, the interview segment ended. I leaned into the mic and opened my mouth to deliver my back announce, which is the brief bit where you identify what you just played and tell people what is coming up next. And then I heard it, coming through my monitor speakers. Through the live feed of what was currently going out over the broadcast. Dead air, yes, but not silent dead air. There was something in it, a sound underneath the static. You have to understand that broadcast dead air is not completely silent. There is always a baseline of electromagnetic noise, a soft hiss that is just the nature of the signal. What I was hearing was underneath that hiss, in it. Woven through it like a thread through fabric. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was hearing, and when I understood, my hand stopped moving on the console and I sat completely rigid in my chair. It was a voice, a child's voice, speaking in a continuous stream, not pausing, not breathing, just speaking in this flat, toneless way that made the words almost impossible to parse at first. I turned up the monitor gain and leaned forward and listened. And the words became clear enough to understand. The child's voice was saying, over and over in this absolutely affectless monotone, it was saying, He is behind you, he is behind you, he is behind you, over and over, not varying, not changing in pitch or pace. Just those 4 words repeated in a continuous loop. He is behind you. He is behind you. I want to be very clear about something. I was alone in that building. The station was in a small standalone building in a commercial park. The doors were locked. The security system was armed. I had checked both when I came in, as I always did, because policy required it. I was alone. But I am going to be honest with you. I did not immediately turn around. I sat there for what had to be a solid 10 seconds, listening to that child's voice coming through my monitor speakers, telling me that someone was standing behind me, and I did not turn around. I think some part of me understood that turning around was going to change something, that as long as I was facing forward, looking at my console, the world was still the world I recognized. Turning around was crossing a line I could not come back from. So I sat there, listening to those 4 words coming out of my speakers from somewhere in the dead air of my own broadcast, and I did not move. Then the voice stopped, mid-sentence. Between a he and an is, it just stopped, and the dead air was suddenly just dead air again, just that soft electromagnetic hiss, and the silence was somehow worse than the voice had been. I turned around. The studio was empty. The hallway beyond the glass booth window was dark and still. Nothing there, nothing anywhere. I checked the broadcast log after my shift. I pulled the recording of the air feed for that 2-minute window. Dead air, just hiss. No voice. Whatever I heard, it had not gone out over the air. It had been in my monitor feed only, which means whatever was producing that sound was inside the building with me, broadcasting directly into my speakers, into my ears only, talking to me and only to me. I have never told my station manager what really happened that night. I told him there was a technical anomaly in the feed and I filed a maintenance report. But I know what I heard, and I know that when I turned around, the room was empty, but the door to the hallway was no longer the way I had left it. I had left it open, the way I always did. When I turned around, it was closed. I want to tell you about the next part of that night because most people, when I have told this story privately, focus on the voice and miss what I consider to be the more disturbing element of what occurred. Because the voice, as terrifying as it was finite. It started and it stopped. It was an event. What followed the voice was not an event. It was a condition. A change in the atmosphere of that room that persisted for the remaining 4 hours of my shift and that I could feel with every nerve in my body. The room felt occupied. There is no more precise way to say it than that. The studio that I had worked in alone for 2 years, the studio where I had always felt comfortable precisely because I knew every sound and shadow of it, felt like a room with someone else in it, a someone I could not see. A presence that moved around the edges of my peripheral vision without ever appearing when I looked directly at it. A presence that breathed. I know that sounds insane, but I promise you with every fiber of my being that for 4 hours I sat at that console and I broadcast and I did my job and something breathed in that room with me. Slow, deep breaths, barely audible, but there. And the worst part, the absolute worst part of those 4 hours was not fear. Fear was there, yes. My hands shook on the console and my voice on the air that night was tighter and thinner than usual, and any listener paying close attention might have noticed something was wrong. But the worst part was not fear. The worst part was the growing, creeping, bone-deep certainty that whatever was in that room with me was not threatening, was not malevolent, was just watching, observing me the way a child watches an insect, with calm, detached, total interest. And somehow, that was so much worse than if it had simply tried to hurt me. Story number 3. I am going to tell you this story the way it was told to me, because it is not my story. It belongs to a man I will call Raymond, because That is not his real name, and he asked me specifically not to use his real name when I told this. Raymond worked overnight radio for 11 years at 3 different stations across the American South. He is one of the most experienced overnight broadcasters I have ever met, and he is also one of the calmest, most level-headed people I know. Raymond does not scare easily. Raymond has seen things in dark studios late at night that would make most people run, and he stayed at his console every single time because, as he once told me, the broadcast comes first. Whatever is happening around you, the broadcast comes first. That is who Raymond is. Which is why, when Raymond told me that there was one night in 11 years of overnight radio that made him physically leave his post, physically walk out of a live, active broadcast and get in his car and drive away, I listened to every single word. Because if something scared Raymond enough to abandon a live broadcast, which is the single most professional sin a radio operator can commit, then whatever Raymond experienced was real, and it was serious, and it deserves to be heard. Raymond was working at a station in a mid-sized southern city, a heritage station that had been broadcasting from the same building since the early 1960s. The building was in an older part of the city, on a street that had seen better decades, surrounded by other commercial buildings that were mostly vacant after 5 p.m. The station occupied the entire ground floor of a 2-story building. The second floor had been used for storage for years and nobody went up there. The stairs were unlocked, but there was nothing up there worth going to see. Just boxes of old transcription discs and program logs going back decades and furniture too old and worn to use. Raymond had worked in that building for about 2 years at the time of the incident. He knew it well. He had done his time being spooked by the usual overnight solo noises and had moved past them to that state of calm familiarity that experienced overnight hosts develop. He was not a nervous person in that building. He had no reason to be. The night it happened, Raymond told me, started like every other night. He was about 3 hours into his shift. It was somewhere around 3 in the morning, and he was running a block of automated programming, which gave him some free time. He decided to use the bathroom, which was at the end of the hallway, and on his way back to the booth he stopped in the break room to get a glass of water. And that is when he heard it from above him. Footsteps, upstairs, walking across the floor above his head. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving from one end of the second floor to the other. Now, Raymond had heard unexplained sounds in that building before. The overnight shift does things to your perception. He did not immediately panic. His first thought was rational. Maybe someone had come in. Maybe the station manager had a key and had stopped by for some reason, unlikely at 3 in the morning, but not impossible. He went to the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The door at the top was closed. He called up, said hello, said is anyone there, said the station manager's name. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped when he spoke. He stood there for a moment, listening. Silence from above. He went back to his booth and kept working. But here is where Raymond's story diverges from the usual unexplained sound story. Because 15 minutes later, the footsteps came back. And this time they were not just walking. They were walking toward the stairs. Raymond heard them cross the ceiling above him, getting closer to the stairwell, closer to the door at the top of the stairs, and then he heard the door at the top of the stairs open. He heard the handle turn and the hinges creak and the door swing open, and then footsteps on the stairs. Coming down, slow, one step at a time, he could hear each individual footfall on the old wooden steps. He could count them, step by step, coming down toward the ground floor, toward the hallway, toward him. Raymond told me he sat at his console and he watched the hallway through the glass of the booth, and he counted the steps, and he knew exactly how many steps were in that staircase because he had walked them 100 times, and he knew that when the count reached 17, the person or thing on those stairs would be at the bottom and would be in the hallway and would be visible through the glass. He counted 14, 15, 16, 17. He watched the hallway, empty, nothing there. The footsteps had stopped. The hallway was dark and still and completely, utterly empty. Nothing had come through the door at the bottom of the stairs. Nothing was standing there. And yet Raymond said, and I believe him, Raymond said that as clearly as he had ever perceived anything in his life, he could feel something standing in that hallway looking at him through the glass. Something that had walked down those stairs but had no physical form that he could see. Something that was now standing 6 feet from him, separated only by the glass of the booth, watching him. He sat very still for a long time, and then he did something he had never done before and has never done since. He stood up. He took off his headphones. He walked to the door of the booth, opened it, walked past whatever was in that hallway without looking at it, walked to the front door of the building, pushed through it, got in his car, and drove away. He called the morning host from a gas station 2 miles away and told him to come in early because he was done. He never worked another overnight shift in that building. He transferred to a daytime slot the following week and never gave a full explanation to anyone at the station for why. He told me once quietly, when we had both had a couple of drinks and the conversation had gone to the places it sometimes goes between people who have done this kind of work late at night, he told me the reason he left was not that he was scared of what was in the hallway. He said he had felt fear before, real fear, and knew what it felt like. What he felt in that moment was different. He said it was recognition, like whatever was in that hallway wanted him to know that it saw him, that it had always seen him, that all those nights he had sat alone in that building thinking he was alone, he had not been. And somehow that truth, delivered all at once in that moment, was more than he could sit with. Raymond is fine today. He still works in radio, daytime shift, different city, different station. He does not talk about this often. When I asked him if I could share his story, he said yes, with the condition that I change his name. And then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Tell them it is not the thing they cannot see that should frighten them. Tell them it is the moment they realize the thing has been there all along." Story number 4. I want to start this one with a question. Have you ever heard a broadcast that was not supposed to be there? A signal bleeding through on a frequency that is otherwise occupied, carrying something on it that makes no sense, something that could not have been transmitted by any known source, something that when you try to record it or trace it simply is not there in any reproducible form. If you have worked in broadcast long enough, you have probably had an experience that approaches that description. There are rational explanations for most of them. Cross-modulation, equipment malfunction, atmospheric conditions that cause unusual signal propagation, pirate broadcasts. All of these things happen, and all of them can produce anomalous audio that sounds strange or inexplicable but has a mundane technical cause. I know this. I spent years in this industry. I understand the technical side as well as anyone. I say all of that to contextualize what I am about to tell you, because I want you to understand that I am not someone who jumps to supernatural explanations. I am someone who exhausted every rational possibility before arriving at the conclusion that what I experienced was not explainable by any technical means I know of. I was working the overnight shift at an AM talk station on the East Coast. AM is interesting because at night, AM signals travel much farther than they do during the day, due to changes in the ionosphere that cause the signal to bounce in ways that daylight prevents. At night, A mid-power AM station can sometimes be heard 1,000 miles or more from its transmitter. This is called skywave propagation, and it is a known, well-documented phenomenon. Because of this, AM stations are sometimes required to reduce power after sunset to avoid interfering with distant stations on the same or adjacent frequencies. Our station did this. We ran reduced power from sunset to sunrise. On a clear night on a good receiver, you could pick up stations from all over the country on the AM dial, and sometimes they would bleed through on your frequency even at reduced power. This is relevant to what happened. This is the first rational explanation I reached for. It turned out not to be sufficient. It was a January night, very cold, very clear. I was about 4 hours into my shift, somewhere around 4 in the morning. I was in the middle of a long recorded program, a nationally syndicated overnight talk show that we carried, and I was using my free time to prep the next hour. The recorded show was running through my monitor speakers at low volume, enough that I could hear if something went wrong technically, but low enough that it was just background. And then, underneath it, I started to hear something else, another voice. Not the host of the recorded program. Another voice coming from somewhere else bleeding through the monitor feed. I turned up the monitor gain to hear it better. It was a man's voice, older sounding, talking in a slow, measured way like a broadcaster, like someone doing an old-style radio program from decades past. The audio quality was different from modern digital audio. It had that warm, slightly compressed, slightly hissy quality of older analog recordings. At first I assumed it was exactly what I said. Skywave bleed from a distant station. I reached for my frequency analyzer to identify the source. The analyzer showed nothing. Our signal was clean, no interference, no bleed through, just our signal clear and uncontaminated. But the voice was still there in my monitors talking. And as I listened, still looking for a technical source, I began to hear what the voice was saying. And that is when the rational explanation started to feel inadequate. The man was reading names. A long, continuous list of names. First name, last name, one after another in a steady, unhurried cadence. Male and female names mixed together, reading them as if from a list. No context, no explanation, just names. I listened for several minutes and he did not stop, just kept reading, name after name, hundreds of them. And then approximately 6 or 7 minutes into this, I heard my own name, my full name, first and last, read in exactly the same cadence as every other name on the list, right in the middle of all those other names, as if it had always been there, as if my name was simply part of whatever list this voice was working through. I went cold, not dramatic horror movie cold, functional cold. The kind of cold where your thinking becomes very precise and very sharp because something in your nervous system understands that precision is what is needed right now. I reached for my recording equipment and started capturing the monitor feed. And as I did, the voice finished my name, continued to the next name on the list, and I was already reaching for my phone to call the station's chief engineer when the voice simply stopped mid-sentence. The way a radio cuts off when someone changes the channel, and the monitor feed was just the syndicated program again, clean and normal and without any trace of what I had just heard. I pulled up the recording. I played it back. The syndicated program, nothing else. Whatever had been in my monitors had not been captured by the recording equipment. It had been real. It had been in the room, but it had left no trace. I called the engineer anyway and described what I had heard. He ran diagnostics. Everything was clean. He had no explanation. I asked him if anything like that had ever been reported before at that station. There was a pause, and then he said carefully, "Well, the building is old. These old AM stations," he said, "they have a history." I asked him what kind of history. He said he would rather talk about it another time. He never did talk about it. But I made a point of doing my own research, and what I found when I looked into the history of that particular transmitter site and the land it sat on was disturbing enough that I have chosen, deliberately, not to share the specific details, because some stones should not be turned over in the context of a story like this. What I will tell you is that the land the transmitter sat on had a very specific and very dark history that predated the station by several decades. And when I found out what had happened on that land, the list of names made a kind of horrible sense that I wish it did not. Story number 5. This is the one I told you at the beginning you needed to wait for. This is the one that changed how I sleep. I am going to ask you, genuinely ask you, to stay with me through every word of this, because the setup matters as much as the conclusion. The details matter, because it is the details of this story that make it what it is, and stripping them away to get to the scary part faster would be doing a disservice to the person who lived through it, which is me. This happened to me. This is mine. And I have not told this publicly before in this much detail to this many people. So I am asking you to honor it with your full attention. 7 years ago, I was working at a small college radio station. It was not a commercial station. It was a non-profit educational station attached to a small liberal arts university in the Northeast. The station was in the basement of one of the oldest buildings on campus, a building that had been built in the 1880s, originally as a dormitory, and had been repurposed several times over the following century. The basement where the station was located had been, at various points in the building's history, a storage facility, a maintenance workshop, and during the early part of the 20th century, a makeshift medical ward during a flu epidemic. I learned this last detail only after everything I am going to tell you had already happened. I want to be very clear about that. I did not know the history of that space when I was working there. I was a graduate student in the communications department. I had a research fellowship that partly involved running the overnight programming at the station several nights a week, and the building was just the building to me. Old, yes. A little worn, yes. The kind of basement that smells like old stone and old wood and something faintly organic that you never quite locate the source of. But just a building, just a basement, just a studio. I had been doing the overnight shifts there for about 4 months when the first thing happened. I was sitting at the console, running a classical music program in the early morning hours, maybe 3 a.m., when I heard a knock at the studio door. Not the outer door that led to the hallway and the building, but the inner door, the one between the main studio and the small production room adjacent to it. The production room that was always locked, that I had never seen unlocked. That, according to the department secretary who managed the facilities, had not been in regular use for years and whose key had been lost at some point and never replaced. Someone knocked on that locked door from inside the production room. 3 knocks, deliberate, even, spaced about 2 seconds apart. I stared at the door. The knock did not repeat. I did not open the door. I am going to be very honest about that. I did not open the door. I sat very still and I watched the door and I made sure I knew exactly where my phone was and I waited. And after about 10 minutes, when nothing else happened, I went back to my work and filed it in the category of explainable sounds that I could not currently explain. 3 nights later, same thing. 3 knocks, same door, same deliberate, even rhythm. This time I called out and asked if anyone was there. Nothing. I knocked back 2 knocks on my side of the door. Silence. And then after maybe 30 seconds, 3 knocks again, answering me. I stood up. I walked to the door. I put my hand on the handle, which was locked, and I rattled it to confirm it was locked, and it was. And then very quietly, so quietly I had to hold my breath to be sure I was really hearing it, from the other side of the door, someone rattled the handle in exactly the same way from their side. matching my motion, responding to it. I let go of the handle. The rattling stopped. I stepped back. I went back to my console and I played 3 more hours of classical music, and I did not go near that door again that night. Over the following weeks, the knocking became a regular occurrence. Not every night, maybe 2 or 3 times a week, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always 3 knocks, always on that door. I started to map it almost involuntarily. My brain was doing that thing brains do when they encounter repetition, looking for pattern, looking for meaning. And I noticed something. The knocking only happened when I was alone. If I had another student in the studio with me, working on a project or keeping me company for part of the night, no knocking. The moment I was alone, it started again. Whatever was on the other side of that door knew when I was alone. And then came the night that changed everything. The night I finally understood what was on the other side of that door, or at least began to understand it. And I wish I could tell you the understanding was a comfort. It was not. It was in late November. I was alone, as I usually was at that hour. I was running a program. The knocking came at its usual time, around 2:30, 3 knocks, and I did something I had been building toward for weeks without quite admitting it to myself. I responded, not by going to the door, but by speaking. I turned toward the door and I said out loud in a clear, steady voice that I was very proud of for not shaking. I said, "I can hear you. That is all. I can hear you." And then I waited, silence for a long time. Long enough that I thought that was it, that there would be no response, that I had broken whatever cycle had been building. And then, from behind that locked door in the locked production room that no one had entered in years, a voice. And I want to describe this voice accurately, because accuracy matters here. It was not a scary movie voice. It was not a growl or a hiss or something immediately identifiable as wrong. It was a voice that sounded, for lack of better language, tired, like someone who had been awake for a very long time, like someone at the end of a very long shift. And in a voice like that, flat and thin and exhausted, it said, "I can hear you too." And then, after a brief pause, it said, "I have been listening to you every night, and I am so tired. I did not sleep properly for 3 months after that night, not because the voice was threatening. Not because of what happened next, which was simply that the voice stopped speaking and the door was quiet for the rest of the shift, and I finished my program and left and never told anyone at the station what I had experienced. Not because of any of those things. I did not sleep because of what the voice said, those specific words. I have been listening to you every night, and I am so tired, because those words implied a continuity, a duration. Something that had been in that room behind that door for God knows how long. Listening to the music and the talking and the college students running their little station in the basement of this old building, night after night, year after year. Something that had heard everything, that had been there in the dark all along. Something that was, as best I could tell from those few words, not malevolent, not dangerous, just present, just listening. Just impossibly, heartbreakingly tired. I cannot decide, even now, years later, whether that is more frightening or more sad than anything else I could have imagined being on the other side of that door. I researched the building afterward, found the history about the medical ward, about the people who had been there during the epidemic, about what that basement had been used for in those early years of the 20th century. I am not going to tell you what I found specifically. Some of you might be able to find it yourself if you look hard enough. But I will say that once I found it, I understood the tiredness in that voice in a way that made me sit down very heavily and stare at nothing for a long time. And I will say that I went back to that studio one more time before I finished my fellowship. I sat at the console in the early morning hours, and I played the most beautiful piece of classical music I could find in the station library. I played it at high volume through the studio monitors, filling that room and probably the production room too with something more than silence. And when the piece was over, I leaned toward the locked door and I said, quietly but clearly, "I hope you can rest now." The door was silent. It remained silent. The knocking never came again, for whatever that is worth. I want to believe it is worth something. These 5 stories, different stations, different people, different parts of the country, but the same essential truth threaded through all of them. The overnight shift is not just a job, it is an invitation. You sit alone in the dark with a microphone and you broadcast yourself out into the night and something out there, something you cannot see and cannot explain and cannot prepare for, broadcasts back. Most nights nothing happens. Most nights it is just you and the silence and the music and the low hum of the equipment. But some nights the silence changes. Some nights something is listening that was not supposed to be. And once you know that, once you have felt it the way these people felt it, the way I have felt it, you never sit alone in a dark room with a microphone quite the same way again. You never stop wondering, even for a second, even in the most ordinary moment of an ordinary night, whether something on the other side of whatever invisible wall separates our world from wherever these things come from is sitting quietly in the dark, perfectly still, perfectly patient, listening to every word.